Hello, I'm Councilman Kevin Howard. I'm very privileged to be able to introduce this video to the community today. The reason why we are providing this to the city is to try to retain the historical perspective of the city of Louisville. I, like many other people in the community, come from somewhere else. We do not necessarily understand or know how the city came to be where it is, how the city, in fact, grew, what trials and tribulations took place. I think it's very important that we all understand our roots, or the roots of the community, to better understand our future, and certainly to put into perspective our present. What we're going to do is take the people who lived through some of that history of this community and try to give their stories, their information, and their trials, and sometimes their happy times, and make sure that the city of Louisville never forgets what it was like growing up. Thank you.
Louisville is one of Colorado's fastest growing communities. Rising from a small, struggling coal mining town into an affluent showplace of spacious homes, tree-lined boulevards, and beautiful parks and recreation areas. Louisville was built on a foundation of hard work, community pride, and a strong sense of family and patriotic values. Founding families instilled a spirit here that continues to thrive today. The memories are here too, but they're fading, along with the remnants of Louisville's past, which are mostly gone. Remnants from a time when the sounds of mine whistles reverberated along the Front Range, and the huffing and puffing of steam locomotives announced the arrivals of new immigrants or the departures of coal trains bound for Denver and other nearby markets. The story of Louisville is not so unusual, because like so many communities in the West, it began quite by accident. It was the 1860s. David Kerr and his family left Kentucky and headed west to escape the Civil War, taking emigrant trails that eventually brought them to this area in 1864, a lush valley with good soil, plenty of water, and abundant wildlife. Kerr was a farmer who began acquiring land under the Preemption Act of 1841, which gave individuals the right to buy the land upon which they settled from the U.S. government.
Because when he settled here, water came up along that fault, what we know as a fault today. He didn't know that it was a fault at that time, but the grass grew up almost hip high, and so he patented the land in quarter 40-acre sections along here, and he followed the fault line because that's where the grass grew.
When David Kerr was plowing in his wheat field one day, he plowed up something he wasn't expecting: coal. Some people believe Kerr's discovery could not have been very surprising, since coal deposits had been found in the region as early as 1859. But what it meant was that David Kerr's life as a farmer would be changed forever, along with the land. Some of Kerr's farm still remains, including this house in which he spent his later years, and a larger house built in 1870, which became a rooming house for miners. The huge cottonwood in front of the house was planted in 1885. John Mayhofer, David Kerr's maternal great-grandson, has continued to operate the farm, outlasting the coal mines. The Rex II mine was located on the farm. A gaping water-filled hole in the farm's bean field was once the mine's 200-foot-deep air shaft. In 1877, a railroad executive, Charles Clark Welch, secured the mineral rights to David Kerr's land and hired Polish immigrant Louis Novotny to find the coal vein beneath the farm. Novotny found the coal and helped establish the Welch mine, which eventually employed about 150 miners. Louis Novotny secured and platted some land in the area and named it Louisville. Most of Louisville's first residents were coal miners, but there were also merchants and farmers. The Silver State Hotel on Front Street, built about 1874, probably saw a thriving business from those early day miners. The town of Louisville was settled by Englishmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, and Welsh, who came here to work in the recently opened mines. The new town grew rapidly with the discoveries of more coal deposits and the construction of more mines. Eventually, it would be situated near the center of the northern Colorado coal fields, which encompassed more than 6,800 square miles. Survival of the mines was dependent upon the railroad, so Louisville was a railroad community before it was officially a town. Steam locomotives burned coal, but the railroad was also, as it is today, the most economical way of transporting coal to market. Louisville would eventually become a small hub, not only for the rail transportation of coal, but also for the interurban, which was a mass transit system that once linked Boulder County with Denver. The railroad brought civilization with it, and Louisville began to blossom. In 1880, the coal mine operators built a huge company store, and for a while it was the major store in which the miners could shop. That's because the miners were not paid in cash. Instead, they were paid in scrip, a type of paper currency which could either be redeemed for cash or taken as payment for the goods they purchased at the company store. Louisville was incorporated in 1882, and private businesses soon developed, including grocery stores, livery stables, and many saloons. Several blacksmiths, or smithies as they were often called, set up shops for the purposes of making horseshoes, wagon parts, and tools. One of them was John Jacob Steinbaugh, a blacksmith who immigrated from Germany and set up shop in 1892.
But we've managed to stick around thanks to the people of Louisville and the surrounding counties and cities. They've helped us grow, and we appreciate that. We enjoy their business, and we hope we can continue doing business in town.
Steinbaugh Hardware is located in a building once occupied by the State Mercantile Company, which was a company store. Along with Louisville's growth came Catholic and Protestant churches and schools. With the development of the community came the need for fire and police protection. Since the town's buildings were constructed of wood, fire was always a big concern. In fact, a portion of Main Street was once destroyed in a blaze. The Louisville Fire Department dates back to the early 1870s, one of the first in the state, organized by coal miners, farmers, merchants, and others who settled this community. Hose companies were formed, comprised of strong, athletically tough men who kept in constant practice. 3 hose carts were stationed at strategic locations around town. Once the department became more mechanized, the carts were used mainly for hose cart races and parades.
These young men and women today of the fire department are required EMT courses, firefighter 1, firefighter 2. They have to take tests, and they're really, qualified today. I'm not saying that we weren't qualified. We were qualified in our day, but things have progressed so much that they just are required to have more training.
The Louisville Fire Protection District is still considered to be one of the state's finest volunteer fire protection organizations. Several historic pieces of fire equipment are on permanent display at the Louisville Firehouse No. 1. The fire department has been a closely knit part of Louisville from the very beginning and will continue to play a key role in its future. During the early days, Louisville's police department consisted of one person called a town marshal. This individual was on call day and night. Later on, a second person was added to work at night. There was a time, in fact, when the town clerk was the daytime police officer, and another officer working at night was known by the kids as the night cop. Only one Louisville police officer has died in the line of duty. Assistant Town Marshal Victor Benedict Helberg was killed by a fruit vendor on October 28, 1915, in a dispute over a $2.50 license fee which the vendor had failed to pay. Today, Louisville's police department has grown into an organization of more than 24 employees. Teams of highly trained officers maintain round-the-clock protection, backed up by well-educated support personnel with computerized record-keeping, a small but skilled detective division, and a locked room where crime evidence is carefully cataloged and stored. Louis Novotny would have been proud, but he didn't stay around long enough to watch his town develop. He had borrowed a lot of money for his land purchases, but those first miners didn't have enough money to buy or invest in any of the property, so it's believed that Novotny left the area to avoid his creditors and tax collectors. He was never heard from again. But the development and decline of northern Colorado's coal industry and the men and women who were part of it make up the real story of Louisville. New immigrants started to arrive from non-English speaking countries such as Italy, France, and Germany, and because of the different nationalities of its settlers, Louisville seemed to become a cluster of small communities all rolled into one.
Northeast of the railroad tracks were the Italians. They called their little community Little Italy. The French people were down in the southeast end of town. The English speaking people were sort of in the middle of town, and the Poles were in the northwest part of the city, or the Polish and German, and that the Germanic languages were in the northwest part of the town. The reason that they segregated themselves like this were just very practical reasons. Their traditions, their language, they went where there were people who spoke their language and who carried on their traditions.
They were a tough lot. This was the only life most of them ever knew. A life underground, working in black, dimly lit tunnels, surrounded by choking coal dust or water and dangerous gases, wearing uncomfortable helmets or caps, with lard oil or carbide safety lamps to light their way, carrying 2-compartment graniteware or aluminum lunch pails, with food in the top compartment, in the bottom liquid, usually water, and manning the tools of their trade. At first, mining methods were primitive and the work backbreaking as the coal was dug out with picks and shovels. Mules became an important part of a coal mine's operations. They pulled the mine cars through the underground tunnels. The mules were often stabled underground and rarely saw sunlight. As a result, some were permanently blind. They were extremely intelligent, though, instinctively knew when their shifts ended, and many were even registered to vote in union elections. The miners were very resourceful and often designed and built their own tools at the mines.
Even the tools that they used in the blacksmith shop, they molded themselves into the kind of tools that they wanted, you know. They were kind of an awkward-looking bunch of tools, you know, but they were what they really had. And they were heavy, made out of solid iron, you know, in them days.
As the mining industry grew, operations became more mechanized. A good example of this mechanization was the development of the punching machine in the 1880s.
Well, it was run by air, just like a jackhammer would, you know. You put the air to it and it would vibrate back and forth like that with a little stinger on it, and just push it back and forth, and then you would start maybe about 3 foot off of the bottom of the vein, and keep on pushing it down like that until you got about 3 feet deep into the coal.
The punching machines displayed across from the Louisville Library and the Recreation Center date from the 1890s. Andy Daborsky was Colorado's chief coal mine inspector when he retired. He found the punching machines while inspecting some abandoned mines and brought them back to Louisville to be put on display. In the early days, wages for coal miners were so low that boys often started working in the mines at very young ages to help with family incomes.
Oh, yeah, back in the earlier days, you could start at 10, 11 years of age. They give you a job, but they referred to them as trappers. And what I mean by that is they had doors in different areas in the mine to circulate the air in different directions, you know. And when the mule or the motor was coming through with a load of coal, these little kids would stand by these doors, and when they'd hear them coming, they'd open the doors for them, see, and then close it again so that you would short the air out from the different areas of the mine.
The coal which was mined in this area was a subbituminous brownish-colored soft coal. Because of its high moisture content, the coal didn't keep very well. It tended to fall apart in dry air, and therefore needed to be used almost immediately after being mined. At first, the coal was only used in nearby homes and businesses. Later on, other nearby markets developed, like the University of Colorado and the Valmont Power Plant in Boulder. Because of the coal's composition, it could never be transported to a market farther away than Denver. The market for this coal was as fragile as the coal itself, and the mining had to be confined to the months in which the coal would be used and sold the most, the wintertime. The miners endured several months of unemployment during the spring and summer months, when the mines cut back operations or shut down completely. During the shutdowns, many of the men worked on farms, in local businesses, and a variety of odd jobs in order to keep their families fed. Times were always hard, it seemed.
Sure did. We didn't have just maybe one pair of socks, stockings, and underwear, whatever. Flush them out at night and put them back on the next day. And I remember going to school when it was bitter cold and the March winds would blow pebbles against your face. It was kind of hard.
Grocery stores competed with the company store by extending credit to out-of-work miners and their families who were struggling to make ends meet. But storekeepers also knew that there was little risk in extending the credit, since family honor bound the miners and their families to pay back their debts. Charles and Iona Thomas operated a Louisville grocery store for over 30 years. They delivered groceries to local residents and provided transportation for people who might otherwise not have been able to get to the store. It was a family business in which their customers were also their close friends.
As you are in business so long, you learn, you see them every day and you know them and you know their kids, and it was hard for us to give up that closeness of seeing them every day and to come home and just retire to, not seeing him and so forth.
But the miners and their families had learned to be very resourceful. Many had gardens and fruit trees. There was also a lot of idleness, with plenty of opportunity to join local organizations and lodges such as the Red Men, the Bachelors Club, the organization for the most eligible men in town, or the Rod and Gun Club, among others. They also loved movies. The Rex Theater was a popular place and stood on Main Street for many years. Today, the building once housing the theater is Senor T's restaurant.
I remember at the old Rex Theater, we'd put the kids there. They had like little, for healthy babies or little beauty pageants, like we entered all the kids. And it was just a fun time.
Louisville had more than its share of saloons. There was a time, in fact, when more than a dozen bars lined both sides of Front Street. Louisville also had a band which played at concerts and community events. But Louisville was also a baseball town, and many men and boys played on several ball clubs which were sponsored by various organizations. Flash Polconi played shortstop on the American Legion team and was part of a double play which won a state championship in the early 1940s. Flash was scouted by the old St. Louis Browns and played in the minor leagues for a couple of years in Oklahoma.
Went down to Muskogee, Oklahoma, and played in what they called the KOM League. It was Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. $175 a month.
Another Louisville ball player, Bert Niehoff, did very well in the major leagues, and Flash says 2 or 3 others were excellent major league prospects, but were hurt in the mines before they had a chance to play. Our ball fields are still as popular today as they were back then, when team rivalries between Louisville and the surrounding communities were almost legendary. Once the cold weather arrived in the late fall, followed by winter snows, baseball was all but forgotten. The mines were reopened and the men returned to their jobs. The work was extremely dangerous. Accidents were numerous, and in many cases, injuries, even serious ones, were treated underground, with injured miners choosing to finish their shifts.
You'd run across a few pockets in the mine, no matter where, that little piece would fall out and fall on your head. I had 2 ration killed that way. I had 2 uncles. Both of them one was my dad's brother and the other was my dad's brother-in-law. Both of them killed out here at the industrial mine of Superior, that with the roof falls like that.
A hospital operated by the Union Labor Hospital Association moved into this building, formerly owned by Black Diamond World, a predecessor of the Louisville Times. The hospital treated serious diseases as well as injuries. The old hospital building still stands today at 721 Grant Avenue. It's now a private residence. Many men also died in the mines from more serious accidents such as fires and explosions. There was a time, in fact, when Colorado's coal mine accident rate rose far above the national average, a statistic that helped contribute to serious labor disputes. When there was an accident, the mine whistle would sound, and miners' wives and families would gather at City Hall or a local drugstore where information on the accident would first be received. The most serious accident was an explosion at the Monarch Mine, January 20th, 1936, in which 10 miners were killed, along with several mules. The bodies of all but one of the miners were recovered.
When we heard about the explosion, we didn't know how many men were down there, and we was all anxious. And there was a Nick Del Pitts that was down there, and Jenkins, and thank God they got out okay though. And Perry and I got married that week. The explosion was on a Monday, and we got married that following Saturday, and there were funerals all that week. And in fact, there was a funeral the day we got married.
The body of Joe Jaramillo was never found, and he lies forever entombed some 300 feet below the hillside monument which bears his name near U.S. Highway 36, south of Louisville. Because of the high potential for accidents, mine rescue operations became increasingly important. Each mine had a trained rescue team, and most teams participated in mine rescue competitions for prizes.
Of course, in case of a mine disaster or a fire, why, some of the bigger mines had what they called a rescue team, see, where you put on your mask and go on in and proceed to rescue the men that was inside there. You know, some of them probably already dead already, and establish the airways and stuff to bring the clean air in.
Mine safety as well as wage and hour issues were of great concern to the miners, and as the demand for coal increased, so did labor problems. Each miner was paid by the ton and had his own mine cars to load. The cars were weighed after they came out of the mines, and miners often accused weigh bosses of cheating them by not correctly reporting the tonnages of their cars. The miners wanted more money, 8-hour workdays, and safer working conditions. Tensions grew between the miners and coal mine operators, and strikes were frequent. There was an unwritten alliance between the coal miners of the northern Colorado coal fields and those of the southern Colorado coal fields near Walsenburg and Trinidad. But there was a basic difference in lifestyles between northern and southern miners. Many northern miners, such as here in Louisville, had been able to make enough money to buy lots and build their own homes, while most of those in the south received less pay and were forced to live in company housing or camps located at the mine sites. By 1900, Colorado had become the largest coal producer west of the Mississippi, and about 20% of the state's 11,000 miners had become members of the powerful United Mine Workers of America. Mine operators strongly resisted any efforts by the UMWA and other unions to force the mines into becoming closed shops. For several years previous, mine owners had been importing miners from Eastern Europe to work as non-union labor and strike breakers. Colorado miners were angry and worried about their jobs. Resentment grew even among the miners themselves. Southern miners wanted what the northern miners already had, and they were openly hostile about it. Louisville miners who had been able to settle disputes with mine owners in a somewhat conciliatory fashion knew they were doing pretty well and wanted to keep working, and also wanted to keep the lid on potential conflicts. But when a general strike was called on November 9, 1903, northern miners felt the pressure and joined the walkout, which involved more than 11,000 coal miners statewide. Louisville miners were back to work in 3 weeks, but they realized that while their wages were increasing by no more than pennies an hour, their workdays were long and their mines were still unsafe. Labor disputes grew in intensity, and the strikebreakers, or scabs as they were called, faced daily threats and intimidation from striking miners. So mine operators brought in hired guns from back east to protect the non-union workers, and by 1910 had built stockades around their properties, turning their mines into armed camps. Company housing was built, and strikebreakers were urged to live on site for their own protection. Many of the mine compounds became small towns of their own, with stores, saloons, and even casinos. Mine tipples were topped with searchlights and guards armed with machine guns. Strikers would shoot out the searchlights occasionally, and the guards would enjoy a little target practice by arbitrarily firing into nearby Louisville buildings. Louisville residents were frightened. Some left town, while others moved their family sleeping quarters into their basements for protection. Gunfire, intense fear, and anger became very much a part of Louisville's way of life in 1910 and would remain that way for several years. The first week of April that year, miners again walked off their jobs statewide and began the longest coal strike in Colorado history, 4 years and 8 months, a strike which ended in tragedy. Striking miners in the South, with no place to live and no place to go, set up a large camp of tents for themselves and their families at Ludlow, north of Trinidad. They called their camp White City. Hardship and anger resulted in mounting frustration, so the Colorado State Militia, commanded by mercenary soldier Lieutenant Carl Linderfelt, was called in to maintain order. On the morning of April 20th, 1914, shots were exchanged between miners and militiamen. Women and children ran for cover. At 7 p.m., Linderfelt and his troops charged the settlement, pouring gunfire into the camp and setting fire to the tents. When it was over, more than 18 people were dead, including 11 children and 2 women who suffocated in this cellar from an accumulation of thick smoke. All that remains of Ludlow today is this monument erected on the site by the United Mine Workers of America. The next day, April 21st, 1914, word of the massacre reached Louisville and other northern communities. The UMWA issued a call to arms for Colorado miners. Louisville's town marshal, Allen McDonald, and Boulder County Sheriff Sanford Buster worked hard to keep an uneasy peace. But the situation in Louisville was heating up. 1 week after the Ludlow incident, April 27th, Colorado Governor Elias Ammons ordered law officers to confiscate the searchlights and machine guns from the nearby mines. That night, Sheriff Buster met with some 400 miners in Louisville to try to calm their fears. But as the meeting was breaking up, gunfire erupted at the Vulcan mine east of town and the Hecla mine north of town. Gunfire started pouring from the Hecla mine compound. Louisville miners scrambled to their homes, grabbed their guns, and headed toward the Hecla to return the gunfire. Sheriff Buster was caught in the middle of a fierce crossfire and could only run for cover. The shooting lasted throughout the night and finally ended at noon the next day. When it was over, buildings at the Hecla were riddled with bullet holes, and a number of men laid wounded and bleeding both inside and outside the compound. All that remains of the Hecla mine today is this home northeast of Louisville, which was Hecla Casino. The house was moved a few yards from its original site, and it has been extensively remodeled. The afternoon of April 28, 1914, 128 state militiamen arrived at Louisville by train. Ludlow was still fresh in everyone's minds, however, and the militia did not receive a cordial welcome. One family recalls that some militiamen were ordered to guard a power plant near present-day Wanaka Lake. Shooting broke out between troops and strikers, catching innocent people in a crossfire. Mary Poydock remembers.
In them days they called it the militia, and they were down there and they were watching the place. And the other guys were down on the main street, you know, main highway, and they were firing back and forth. And my dad took us, all of our sisters, there were 7 of us, took us and got out of the back window of the house, and we crawled the ditch all the way up to our neighbors, Pete DiGiacomo. And when my mother was going across, she was carrying a dishpan with something, and a bullet hit the dishpan.
Within a few days, the militiamen were relieved of their duties by federal troops. The 12th Cavalry from Fort Robinson, Nebraska, arrived by train on May 3rd. They were welcomed with open arms, and peace was, for a while at least, restored to Louisville. The Ludlow Massacre and the shootings in Louisville prompted President Woodrow Wilson to issue a directive saying that no more strikebreakers were to be imported into the Colorado coal fields. By December 10, 1914, after considerable mediation, the strike was over and the miners went back to work. Less than 3 years later, however, many of the miners would be armed once again, but this time they would be fighting in the trenches of Europe in World War I. In 1918, Louisville's favorite sons returned home and were honored with a huge victory parade and a very special Armistice Day celebration. Those who did not return are remembered on an honor roll placed at the Louisville Cemetery. The war was over in Europe, but the battles continued here at home. Strikes, sporadic violence, and shootings continued. Labor problems had forced many mines to close. Unemployment was high, and working conditions in the mines that were still operating seemed worse than ever. A new, more militant union surfaced in Colorado, the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. IWW organizers like 50-year-old Adam Bell made big promises and were very effective at organizing minorities and foreign-born miners who felt they hadn't been given a voice in union matters. November 21st, 1927, with Bell in the lead, hundreds of striking miners and their wives from Louisville and surrounding communities charged the gates of the Columbine mine east of Erie. After warning shots failed to disperse the picketers, security forces and Colorado National Guardsmen fired into the crowd, killing 7 people and wounding nearly 24 others. The dead included 26-year-old Renee Jacques of Louisville. Bell was beaten and severely injured. Today, a large sign on Colorado Highway 7 south of the Columbine mine site is the only memorial to the incident. Shortly afterward, martial law was put in effect in Boulder and Weld counties, and more than 300 Colorado National Guardsmen were called out to maintain the peace and protect 3 mines, including the Monarch near Louisville. Within a year, however, many of the miners returned to work with a new United Mine Workers contract, just in time for the Great Depression. While Louisville men were off working in the mines or enduring the daily struggles of trying to keep their jobs intact, their wives were primarily homemakers. They didn't have the benefits of modern conveniences, so the work was hard. They cooked on wood or coal-burning stoves. They washed in washtubs and scrubbed their clothes on washboards. And since they were always needing to economize, they canned enough fruits and vegetables from their gardens to take their families through the winters.
The women did a lot of visiting, a lot more visiting than they do now. It wasn't uncommon for them to meet at a house in the afternoon, and 3 or 4 women would sit and do fancy work or their darning or mending and visit in the afternoons. They also formed quilting bees. They met several times a month in each other's homes to quilt.
Some women worked part-time in stores and other businesses to help earn extra money. Other women, like Jeanette Taylor, owned businesses. Mrs. Taylor owned a livery stable and unfortunately was killed by her husband in 1902. Later on, new jobs became available for women, such as working in Louisville's soon-to-be famous Italian restaurants like the Blue Parrot.
The women used to love to work together, you know. She would get these tomatoes, and this country was just loaded with tomatoes. And I can't understand why they don't grow them around here anymore. But anyhow, they'd go out and pick the tomatoes and come here, and the whole little kitchen was just full of baskets of tomatoes, and they would peel them, you know, just peel them, and then they would cook them, and they'd make their own, boil the tomatoes down and make the conserva, or the spaghetti paste. They would call it conserva. So she used to take this and they'd concentrate that by the sun, and every once in a while they'd go out and stir it, see, but the sun, it concentrated, see. Now they use, I don't know, you know how they use heat different ways, but the way she did it, boy, it was a hard way of doing it. So my brother and I, we got real smart one day, and we got out there and was making mud pies out of it, you know. And, oh Lord! And the work that my mother put in that, it's a wonder she didn't kill us.
Many women were active in the Roman Catholic Church. Women in the Methodist Church started the tradition of distributing Christmas treats to all the children in town. They also founded the first Fall Festival in the 1930s to help pay their minister. Today, the Fall Festival is still one of Louisville's most popular events. The women also have their lodges, such as the Royal Neighbors of the Woodcraft. And like their men, they also participated in sports, which included a very active women's softball league.
Yeah, Mina played first base.
I was first baseman.
And I was a pitcher and third baseman and out in the outfield, wherever I was needed.
The women were very supportive of their husbands, and it was not unusual for them to join the picket lines during strikes. Women often got together to prepare food for their husbands and others who were walking the picket lines or were involved in other strike-related activities. December 7th, 1941, the United States was again at war. Another opportunity to serve the country, a chance to leave the mines. More than 350 young men and women from Louisville left home to fight battles in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. A remarkable statistic when you consider that number came very close to 1/4 of Louisville's population of 2,000. Here at home, they were not forgotten. They were remembered on Memorial Day, paper drives, and bond drives. Some did not return, but the lives of those who did were changed forever by the war, and many turned their backs on mining and found jobs in other industries. Louisville has always been a very patriotic community, ready to answer the nation's call, with men and women participating not only in both world wars, but in Korea and Vietnam as well. Louisville has always been a community in which children could grow up amid the security of strong family bonds. Chris Rizai, Mina Tassoni, and Mary Poidock are sisters who grew up on a farm just north of Louisville. Their father, Robert DiGiacomo, owned the first automobile in Louisville, a Rio which he purchased in 1906. The gentleman shown with him in this photograph is Tom Rizai, the man who would become Chris's father-in-law. Their sister-in-law, Marion DiGiacomo, still resides on the family farm, despite the encroachment of houses and streets. Growing up on the farm meant that there was usually plenty of food on hand. But the DiGiacomo farm was more than a growing place. It was a gathering place where friends and families could enjoy a variety of activities. One of the most memorable was when they gathered to butcher some hogs.
But I do remember we butchered hogs, like Marion said. And Mother would do all the butchering. And she would take it to the sick people or the people that needed food. After all, she raised a big family, and she was a good mother.
The women also remember burying bottles of wine for their father under a big tree on the farm during Prohibition. The DiGiacomo story is not so unusual. Louisville was always a community in which families had time for each other, and whatever struggles came their way, they faced them together. Louisville was a community in which parents were committed to their children. Children amused themselves by playing a variety of games and participating in activities such as May Day festivals and dances. There weren't any parks, so they played in the dirt streets, and if they weren't off the streets by the 8 p.m. curfew, the town marshal would pick them up and bring them home, much to the embarrassment of their parents. Times were hard for most Louisville residents, and the child fortunate enough to have a bicycle was very lucky indeed. There was always a commitment to education here. That meant fulfilling the need for good schools. In the early days, students attended classes in several buildings. Construction of a school building was started in 1880, but was suspended for some time and was later completed around 1902. Rooms were added later, and this little brick schoolhouse was built in 1903 to house the first and second grades. Another building was built in 1920 to house the high school. It was later considered to be a fire hazard and declared unsafe. A new high school was built in 1939 and today serves as the Louisville Middle School. This building was a project of the Works Progress Administration known as the WPA. It was constructed as part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. The little red brick schoolhouse still stands, while the larger school building was torn down in the 1960s, and the site today is occupied by Memory Square Park. By 1940, as natural gas was becoming the primary power source for homes and businesses, Colorado's coal industry was dying, and mines were closing on a regular basis. Some of the abandoned mines caught fire. The fires burned for months. The ground around the mines was so hot the air would be filled with steam. Abandoned coal mine tunnels still run beneath Louisville's streets, but the fires no longer burn, and there is no danger of city streets or buildings falling into the tunnels. The danger has long passed, along with the industry itself, and today only one miner remains dressed for a day underground. Where once Louisville sustained life for a few hundred coal miners and their families, it has now become a commuter's town, all but losing the cultural identity that made it unique. And yet, while its coal fields disappear beneath rows of new homes, shopping center, senior recreation center, well-manicured parks, and one of the best public golf courses in the state, there are some things that have not changed. Black soil is still being plowed up in the field where David Kerr first found coal. Trains still rumble through town, even though they're just passing by, rarely stopping long enough to even tie up traffic. Louisville is still a family community, where parents are committed to their children, where children have a place to grow up, a place to call home, where neighbors still have time to visit. And while the dreams of some have crumbled into the dust of forgotten minds, progress has finally, at long last, brought to Louisville the one thing that David Kerr, Louis Novotny, and all the miners fought so hard to achieve for themselves: prosperity. And only their memories live on. As it's been written, to live in the hearts we leave behind is not to die.